Ray, are you there?
Hello?
Ray? Hey. Welcome back.
Hello?
Oh, hey.
Yeah, hi. I'm just asking again if everyone's got the handouts.
No. No.
Oh, you don't have the
Yes.
handout.
Okay. Okay, Billy, if you just give me an email, I'll send it to you right now. I'll just email it directly. Great, okay.
Could you email me as well, Ray?
Yes.
I'm Matthew. Matthew Donovan.
No. Right. Let's continue, okay? So we're just about to introduce Marx's critique of Feuerbach. But Feuerbach's key claim is that the essence of being human is human communality. The essence of communality is interpersonality, which is precisely contrasted to intersubjectivity. This is why Feuerbach writes that the essence of man is contained only in the community. This is number 3 on the handout. In the unity of man with man, a unity, however, that rests on the reality of the distinction between I and you. In other words, it rests on the sensuous reality of the distinction between persons, okay, or between selves. So it assumes that personhood is the root of communality. And then Feuerbach continues ultimately that this is the quotation in bold in quotation number 4. The highest and ultimate principle of philosophy is the unity of man with man. All essential relationships, the principles of the various sciences, are only different kinds and modes of this unity. So now, this is important because, in a way, what I think Feuerbach is doing here is that I think this is the key to understanding, Feuerbach's, in a way, kind of quasi-transcendental conversion or reinscription of sensuous reality. The roots of sensuousness for Feuerbach is communality, and the root of communality is interpersonality. So this is why all essential relationships are merely different, modes, different modalities of this unity, which is the unity of the interpersonal relation. Now, this is what Feuerbach means by, I think, by sensuousness, okay? And this is why sensuousness is precisely not something that is merely of the order of sensory experience. Okay? It has a, it's fundamentally transvaluated in Feuerbach's work. Okay, so Marx's intervention. This is, I think, where we can first situate Marx's critical intervention vis-a-vis Feuerbach. So for Marx, the social relation is irreducible to the interpersonal because it's rooted in social production, which operates behind the back of consciousness, whether personal or interpersonal. Okay, so this is what I think we have to, to bear in mind when we read Marx's theses on Feuerbach. I'm only going to read basically 4 of them here. There's 11, as you know. They're most of them are very short, but I just want to focus on 4 of them here, and then go on to elaborate what I think, the underpinnings of Marx's critique as developed particularly in the German ideology, okay, which will be the focus of the remainder of today's handout. Okay, so Marx's first thesis on Feuerbach states that the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, or sensuousness is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence, in contradistinction to materialism, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, really distinct from the thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity. Hence, in the essence of Christianity, he regards a theoretical attitude as the only genuinely human attitude, while practice is conceived and fixed only in its Judaical manifestation. Hence, he doesn't grasp the significance of revolutionary or practical critical activity. So here we see, so the key contrast here is between Marx's practical materialism or practical critical materialism and Feuerbach's merely sensuous materialism. And I think that what Marx is suggesting here is that even though, sensuousness has been de-empiricized by Feuerbach, and it's been, reconceived as the core of the interpersonal relation, which is at the source of all human communality. This communality is still, is an object of contemplation. In other words, communality, as prioritized by Feuerbach, is still merely an object of contemplation. And in a way, even that the interpersonal relation is still developed, or in a way kind of unfolded in a merely theoretical or contemplative register. So in other words, so what Marx is suggesting here is that in a way he accepts Feuerbach's emphasis on the primacy of the sensuous, or the conceptual irreducibility of the sensuous, but he says that the root of sensuousness is human practice. And it's human practice which is, in a way, the condition of possibility for human sociality. So the key distinction is between, obviously contemplation and practice, but also between communality and sociality. Sociality for Marx is precisely what can never be comprehended at either at the intersubjective or the interpersonal level. So the secret of sociality is hidden or occluded from consciousness, whether that is intersubjective consciousness or even interpersonal consciousness. And this is something that I think we will try to kind of develop as we progress through the handouts. The second thesis states, the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but a practical question. Man must prove the truth, i.e. the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question. So what's interesting here is that there's a new, this emphasis on the primacy of practice entails relinquishing any metaphysical conception of truth, which is basically the kind of the understanding of truth in terms of a correspondence between thoughts and things, or between concepts and objects. Truth, in a way, I think what Marx is saying is that the adequation of thought and thing is realized in and through practice, and this is why, and practice, which is sensuous practice or an intervention at the level of sensuous reality, is the only yardstick for measuring the truth of thinking. It's this sidedness, as he puts it. And this is also something that, although it's simply kind of presented as an aside at this point, it's very important later for when we try to kind of understand the relationship between theory and practice in Marx, but also the relationship between Marx's critique of political economy and the social reality that critique is supposed to be, effectively transforming. And this will be an important question when we look at, the Grundrisse and Capital in a few weeks' time. Now, thesis number 4 continues. Feuerbach starts out from the fact of religious self-alienation, of the duplication of the world into a religious world and a secular one. His work consists in resolving the religious world into its secular basis, but that the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself as an independent realm in the clouds can only be explained by the cleavages and self-contradictions within this secular basis. The latter must, therefore, in itself be both understood in its contradiction and revolutionized in practice. Okay. Finally, the thesis number 6. Feuerbach resolves the religious essence into the human essence, but the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, is the ensemble of the social relations. Feuerbach, who does not enter upon a criticism of this real essence, is consequently compelled, one, to abstract from the historical process and to fix the religious sentiment as something by itself, and to presuppose an abstract, isolated human individual. And secondly, essence, therefore, can be comprehended only as a genus, as an internal dumb generality, which naturally unites the many individuals. Okay, so the 2 points here concern Marx's attempt to transform the meaning of essence, and specifically of the very notion of human essence or species being. So the first claim is that there is such a thing as human species being, but it can only be understood as embedded within a historical process. It is intrinsically historical, and once understood historically, human species being must be tied to practical production, or social production and reproduction. That's the first. The essence is not fixed and unchanging. It's something. It's a system of relations, and it's a system of practices which undergo transformations over time. And this is why, and it's because of this, that essence isn't simply a kind of an empty container, or a kind of a neutral medium within which that kind of comprises abstract characteristics or attributes, but it's a system of dynamic relations between historically embedded individuals. But the meaning of individual changes here. Marx's point is that, in a way, at the level, so long as contemplation is, idealistically, abstracted from the dimension of practice, then human individuality is also a mere abstraction, and it's the individuality of the as the individuality codified by bourgeois philosophy, which sees the self as the thinking subject, which is also the bearer of various juridical rights and social privileges. So society can't simply be understood as a collection of individuals. At the same time, society can't be reduced to communality as another kind of abstract relation between pre-constituted selves, or already individuated selves. Okay, so this is it's not yet clear what Marx is proposing. We only know what he's rejecting here. But it's important to bear in mind that although he will use the term individual in what follows, especially in the German ideology, and his criticisms of these Hegelian thinkers, the meaning of individuality undergoes a radical transformation once it's understood that individuality is nothing over and apart from a set of historically variable social relations. Okay, so now we move on to the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. So here, this is a continuation of his critique of the Feuerbachian conception of essence. For Marx, we must understand species being in practical and historical terms. And it's practical historical species being, which is the source, which is the only source for the universality and freedom of human existence. So Marx writes, this is quote number 1 on page 3, man is a species being, not only in that practically and theoretically he makes both his own and other species into his objects, but also, and this is only another way of putting the same thing, because he relates to himself as to the present living species, in that he relates to himself as to a universal and therefore free being. The point is that the dimensions of universality and freedom invoked here are not atemporal or invariable characteristics. They are a function of an unfolding historical dynamic and a set of practical and a set of human practices. So universality must be tied to practice on one side and to history on the other side. Then Marx continues, and I'll just read the sections in bold from quotation number 2 because it's quite long. From the theoretical point of view, plants, animals, stones, air, light, etc. form parts of human consciousness, partly as objects of natural science and partly as objects of art. They are his intellectual inorganic nature, his intellectual means of subsistence, which he must first prepare before he can enjoy and assimilate them. From the practical point of view, too, they form a part of human life and activity. Physically, man lives solely from these products of nature, whether they appear as food, heating, clothing, habitation, etc. The universality of man appears in practice precisely in the universality that makes the whole of nature into his inorganic body, in that it is both 1, his immediate means of subsistence, and also 2, the material object and tool of his vital activity. Nature is the inorganic body of man. That is, insofar as it is not itself a human body. So it's, you know, the universality of the human is manifested in practice, okay? In that what is peculiar about, you know, the human animal is its ability to convert, you know, to obviously to transform its own ecological sphere, transform its own environment, you know, at a rate faster than its environment is able to transform it, and to convert, as what Marx calls the whole of nature, into an extension of its organism. So the social metabolism, in a way, the way in which human beings produce and reproduce their conditions of material existence, entails a transformation of nature. And it's in this sense, in a way, that nature becomes the inorganic body of the human. And this is important because in this sense, the inorganic is constitutive of the sociality of human existence. Okay, this is sort of, I think this will have interesting repercussions later. So now we get to, okay, the slightly more kind of detailed critique of Feuerbach in the German ideology from 1846. Again, I'll just read out the passages in bold because these are quite long quotations. So in number 3, Marx and Engels write, Feuerbach does not see that the sensuous world around him is not a thing given direct from all eternity, remaining ever the same, but the product of industry and of the state of society. and indeed a product in the sense that it is a historical product, the result of the activity of a whole succession of generations, each standing on the shoulders of the preceding one, developing its industry and its intercourse, and modifying its social system according to the changed needs. Okay. Even the objects of the simplest sensuous certainty are only given him through social development, industry, and commercial intercourse. Okay. So this means, so here Marx is emphasizing there is no dimension of sensuous reality, or so-called allegedly natural reality, which isn't in a way kind of mediated or conditioned by the social relation. In other words, by the dynamic interplay between social production and reproduction. So a relationship, so human beings are a part of nature, but in a way there is no part of nature that is untouched by the social relation, which is at the core of human being. And they continue in quotation number 4, so much is this activity, this unceasing sensuous labor and creation, this production, the foundation of the whole sensuous world as it now exists, that were it interrupted only for a year, Feuerbach would not only find an enormous change in the natural world, but would very soon find that the whole world of man and his own perceptive faculty, nay, his own existence, were missing. Okay. Now, this is not, as it's sometimes claimed, this is not a kind of, wild kind of, social constructivism, or kind of social idealism. Marx is perfectly clear that there is, a dimension of nature, which is, whose existence is entirely independent of human practical activity. But his point is simply that insofar nature as we know it, and nature insofar as we either cognize it or act upon it, is always already enveloped by the social relation. In other words, there is no kind of nature in itself that exists. There is no nature in itself that can be known independently of our practical relationship to it. And the practical relation conditions the cognitive relation. But this is not to say that nature is somehow, that the infrastructure of nature, as limbed by natural science, is simply itself manufactured by human practical activity. Marx, I think, is very clear about that distinction. Finally, in paragraph 5, he writes, Feuerbach has a great advantage over the pure materialist since he realizes that man too is an object of the senses, but apart from the fact that he only conceives him as an object of the senses and not as sensuous activity, because he still remains in the realm of theory and conceives of men not in their given social connection, not under their existing conditions of life which have made them what they are, he never arrives at the actually existing active man, but stops at the abstraction man and gets no further than recognizing the actual individual corporeal man emotionally. In other words, i.e., he knows no other human relations of man to man than love and friendship, and even then idealize. He gives no criticism of the present conditions of life. Thus, he never manages to conceive the sensuous world as the total living sensuous activity of the individuals composing it. And as Marx points out, he doesn't understand that this, the world, the sensuous reality composed by the activity of human beings is contradictory. It is riven by these fundamental contradictions, which are ultimately social in nature. So finally, number 6, Marx and Engels write, this is why Feuerbach's communalism is insufficient to grasp what is most radical about communism. And they write, Feuerbach's whole deduction with regard to the relation of men to one another is only aimed at proving that men need and always have needed each other. He wants to establish consciousness of this fact. That is to say, like the other theorists, he merely wants to produce a correct consciousness about an existing fact. Whereas for the real communist, it is a question of overthrowing the existing state of things. So in other words, Marx and Engels are proposing that, in a way, the communal bond or the interpersonal relation is conditioned by a dimension of productive practical activity, okay, which generates contradictions and inequalities in the relationships between humans. There will never be harmony or reciprocity at the interpersonal level unless the constitutive contradictions in social production and human practice are eliminated. This is why the contradictions at the level of theory, or contradictions which are contemplated in the cognitive domain, can only be practically resolved, because their resolution entails fundamental transformation of the modalities of human practice that generate these contradictions. Finally, this is why. So Marx's materialism is tied to this claim that all human consciousness is rooted in social practice, and this is why he can insist that the social relation is the source of the materiality of human consciousness. And in number 7, he writes, the mind is from the outset afflicted with the curse of being burdened with matter, which here makes its appearance in the form of agitated layers of air, sounds, in short, of language. Language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical, real consciousness that exists for other men as well, and only therefore does it also exist for me. Language, like consciousness, only arises from the need, the necessity of intercourse with other men. Where there exists a relationship, it exists for me. The animal does not relate itself to anything. It does not relate itself at all. For the animal, its relation to others does not exist as a relation. Consciousness is therefore from the very beginning a social product, and remains so as long as men exist at all. Now, just to clarify something here, this could be, I think, interpreted that tying consciousness to language, as Marx does here, in a way, it does seem as if it could be aligned with the Feuerbachian perspective, insofar as consciousness, language arises from the need for communication, and it seems that communication is necessarily interpersonal. So therefore, the question is, doesn't this make doesn't this make the interpersonal relation more fundamental? The condition for the existence of consciousness. But I think the key, for Marx here, is that intercourse between humans is not primarily interpersonal. In other words, social intercourse, relations between producers and consumers, or economic relations of production, exchange, distribution, and consumption, precede any possible interpersonal relations. Or interpersonal relations can't be abstracted from relations of social production and reproduction. So this is why even language itself will be shaped by human practices, which are themselves irreducible to the dimension of interpersonal intercourse. And this is why, and it is this dimension of productive practice in a way which is always, operating, behind the back of consciousness, in a way behind the back of language or communication itself, which is why human social relations are not transparently communicable at the interpersonal level, because language itself is structured by these social relations. Okay, so now we come to Marx's, Marx and Engels' materialist conception of history, or what will be known as historical materialism, which is the claim emphasizing the primacy of social reproduction over ideation. In other words, so here, this is the opening of the German ideology, in which Marx and Engels critique both, left and right Hegelians. For the debate between left and right Hegelians unfolds in the contemplative sphere. It's a battle of ideas, or a war of ideas, which ultimately boils down to a conflict of interpretations. But the point is that these conflicting interpretations are, materially conditioned by social practices, which can't themselves be, reduced or reinscribed within the dimension of interpretation. In other words, a change in consciousness will never suffice to transform reality. As Marx and Engels write in number 8, this demand to change consciousness amounts to a demand to interpret the existing world in a different way, to recognize it by means of a different interpretation. But this is insufficient, because for Marx and Engels, the real premise of materialism is that human social production is the ultimate determinant of ideation. So, as they write in quotation number 9, the premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones. They are not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions of their life, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. Now, a warning about this in the German ideology and elsewhere in these kind of writings by these early writings of Marx's, there are many kind of the term empirical often crops up, and in a way, it invites misunderstanding, because it seems that he's talking about a level of empirical reality which is somehow accessible to cognition. But in fact, if one understands, what Marx means by sensuousness, in a way, the weird paradox of Marx's materialism is that sensuousness is empirically inaccessible. In other words, there is no empirical access to sensuous reality, because it's not transparent either to individual consciousness, individual perceptual consciousness, nor is it transparent even to theoretical consciousness, which is conditioned by ideology, in a way which can only kind of apprise that reality by misrecognizing its fundamental character. And this is something, we'll return to in a minute. But the point is that the real premise of historical materialism is what Marx calls real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions of their life, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. But again, although despite Marx's appeal to the empirical here, the important point to remember here is that this activity, this practical activity, and the conditions for this activity and the conditions generated by this activity are never merely, empirically accessible to individual theoretical consciousness. Moreover, human activity, in this sense, is both determined by existing conditions and produces new conditions. It's this circuit of conditioned and conditioning activity that is the empirically, as opposed to logically real starting point for materialist theory. It is concretely sensuous, as opposed to supersensuous in Feuerbach's sense. But it's not an abstract datum or a matter of fact of the sort favored by philosophical empiricism. Thus, the history of humanity, including the history of humanity's relation to nature, is the history of social production and reproduction. No sensuous datum is merely given, it has always been socially produced. So, as they write in number 10, the first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these human needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this is a historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely in order to sustain human life. Even when the sensuous world is reduced to a minimum, to a stick, as with St. Bruno, it presupposes the action of producing this stick. The last sentence is a reference to Bruno Bauer, who's a target, who's a kind of a left Hegelian, who's being targeted by Marx and Engels here. The point they're making is even the perception of something as simple as a stick, the sensuous reality of the stick is itself has been made, not given, because even there is no feature of no objective characteristic of this natural physical object, which is not in a way contaminated by cognitive categories that are themselves a reflection of productive relations. The cognitive categories that we use to characterize the reality around us is itself conditioned by our practical activities, by the ceaseless kind of dynamism of production and reproduction. And this is why then the difference between the human and the animal is materially produced by human activity. It's not a metaphysical or transcendental difference. Humans differentiate themselves from other animals in practice before distinguishing themselves from them in theory. So Marx and Engels write in 11, men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. But they themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their material life. And the way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends, first of all, on the nature of the means of subsistence they actually find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the reproduction of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it's a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. Hence, what individuals are depends on the material conditions of their production. This production only makes its appearance with the increase of population. In its turn, this presupposes the intercourse of individuals with one another. But the form of this intercourse is again determined by production. So here we see that the development of material production determines the development of social relations. In number 12, they write, not only the relation of one nation to another, but also the whole internal structure of the nation itself depends on the stage of development reached by its production and its internal and external intercourse. And this, evolution of material production goes hand in hand with the division of labor, and which in turn conditions the development of forms of property. In number 13, they write, the various stages of development in the division of labor are just so many different forms of property, i.e. the existing stages in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instrument, and product of labor. Now, okay, just to recap here. So the claim is, I mean, I take, kind of the gist of the account being offered here, is that so men, humans begin to produce, they produce what they need in order to be able to survive and to reproduce. But they quickly develop, increasingly sophisticated ways of satisfying these material needs. Food, clothing, shelter. Okay, and as Marx's conjecture in that in human history, as human social groups expand in number, in a way, the more successful, the more efficient humans become at satisfying their material needs and ensuring their material reproduction, the more their population will expand. And then the more the population expands, in a way, the more internally differentiated the structure of production becomes. So this is the root of the division of labor, that there are more and more collective tasks are broken down into kind of I guess discrete component parts or functions and allocated to different members of the community or group. So this is why there's a direct relationship between the developments of productive forces and the development of the division of labor. They go hand in hand, according to Marx and Engels. But at each stage, in a way, the more labor is differentiated, in a way, the more this has a kind of a, this feeds back into the production process. Production itself becomes more efficient and more sophisticated. Now, in the German ideology, Marx and Engels have a lot to say about how this dynamic plays out over history and the evolution of social formations. But for the time being, I just want to focus on, again, in so-called vulgar Marxist account. This is, we have a kind of a straightforward distinction between the base and the superstructure. Okay, the basic idea is that at the base is productive forces and social relations. We've got forces of production which condition social relations, which feed back into productive forces. This is the kind of the fundamental or the base stratum of society, and everything else, everything requiring, everything that kind of is generated in and through human consciousness belongs at the level of the superstructure. Now, this is, okay, I think this is not really, even in Marx and Engels, this is actually not, the picture isn't quite so simple, because they don't rule out a feedback, a more complicated feedback mechanism through which, in a way, the superstructure can also retroactively determine the infrastructure. But the point is that there is a hiatus separating practice, productive practice, from consciousness. Okay, and I think this is fundamental for Marx. And this distinction doesn't require the base superstructure distinction, I think. So what Marx and Engels are pointing to is a distinction between the reality of material production, as it is. The reality of material production is not as it appears in the consciousness of producers or consumers. In 14, they write, the social structure and the state are continually evolving out of the life process of definite individuals. However, of these individuals, not as they may appear in their own or other people's imagination, but as they actually are, as they act and produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions and conditions independent of their will. Okay, and this is why consciousness is therefore the inverted reflection of real social relations. The limitations of material production and social relations impose this inversion upon consciousness. In number 15, Marx and Engels write, if the conscious expression of the real relations of these individuals is illusory, if in their imagination they turn reality upside down, then this in its turn is the result of their limited material mode of activity and their limited social relations arising from it. I'll read number 16 as well, because it develops this idea straightforwardly. Men are the producers of their conceptions, their ideas, etc. That is, real active men, as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces and of the intercourse corresponding to these, up to its furthest forms. But consciousness, das Bewusstsein, can never be anything else than conscious being, der Bewusstsein. And the being of men is their actual life process. If in all ideology men and their relations appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life process. Okay, so I want to pause here on this. This is a very famous metaphor in German ideology. So the claim is that ideology, systematically inverts real relations or real social relations between productive forces and human classes. And the claim that Marx and Engels are making is that this is not merely, this misrepresentation is itself socially conditioned, and in a way is inevitable or unavoidable. It can't simply be kind of revoked by cognitive fiat. It's not something that can be rectified at the level of. Why? Because it's conditioned by what Marx calls their historical life process. Because this phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversions of objects on the retina does from their physical life process. In other words, that just as the inversion of spatial relations on the retina is a condition of visibility in the physiological domain, so I think what Marx is suggesting here is that ideological inversion or ideological misrepresentation in a way is structurally necessary, is materially conditioned and unavoidable. So that there's a necessary relationship between a stage of configurations of relations between productive forces and social relations, and the way in which they are represented, or the way in which they are consciously, understood or interpreted. So I think that the important suggestion here, in a way, is that material reality conditions its own ideological misrepresentation. And the key to understand, and so in order to understand the nature of the misrepresentation or the ideological inversion, we have to understand the character of this material activity or productive activity. But the paradox, but now the question is, how do we get to this dimension of this stratum of material production if it is systematically inverted by consciousness, by the consciousness which it generates and conditions? And I think this is a problem that it will take Marx, that Marx will not satisfactorily resolve until he writes Capital. Okay, now I'm gonna just read out one final passage here. Then I'm going to stop so we can, have time for discussion. So ideology, whether it's religious, juridical, economic, philosophical, or scientific, is the inverted image of social existence, understood as the circuit of conditioned and conditioning productive activity. So hence, as Marx famously put it, it's not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. One caveat here is that I think some philosophers reading these passages, there's, I think, a kind of a temptation to inflate life here into some kind of, into some kind of master category. But I think what Marx means by life, or by the historical life process, he doesn't mean anything metaphysical. He certainly doesn't, he certainly doesn't mean anything that could be kind of, inflated into some kind of, ur-principle. He simply means productive activity. Okay? He simply means social production and reproduction. So I think, once again, I think a philosopher like, Michel Henry, I think, bases his entire interpretation of Marx by taking these passages and, in a way, interpreting this, these references to the life process or to life in, I think, in a kind of, in a transcendental phenomenological register, which I think, it re-phenomenologizes Marx's materialist critique of the primacy of consciousness, which I think is a mistake, because I think that what's most radical about Marx's materialism at this point, and why it's a real challenge to philosophy, is precisely it's the first delineation of what he will call socially necessary false consciousness, and the claim that what human beings do, practical productive activity, is unconscious. Okay? It's not simply that we're not. It's not simply that we don't think about it while we're doing, and then we can subsequently recapture it through reflection. It's that this dimension, that this dimension of practical productive activity is necessarily misrecognized, misrepresented in consciousness. I think that's Marx's radical proposition here. Okay, I want to stop because I realize we've been going for quite a while. So just any questions about what we've said, what I've gone through so far? Would anyone like to ask? Sure, Rachel, go ahead. Okay. Yes. Okay. So Rachel's question: is your microphone not working, Rachel?
My mic is working.
My mic is working.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'll just read out your question. Yeah. The question is: can I say a little bit more about the temporality of ideology here? Yeah. But can you just say quickly what you had in mind by temporality here, temporality of ideology?
Sure. What I had in mind was. So I'm going to take my headphones off to do this. Okay. Yeah. Sure. What I had in mind was questions along the line of historical materialism and ideology as as a concept with a materiality of its own, if you could say that. I mean, that it's not an idealism there. It's ideology. It exists. It has a historical process behind it. It's a thing, which makes me think about temporality in a way and wonder if it has in the historical process of its own, does ideology have to have a long development? Can it happen quickly? I mean, things along this line. When you're talking about this inverted image of social existence as a circuit of conditioned and conditioning productive activity, so those are very specific sort of processes there, and also these allusions that he's making, talking about a camera and giving it this very material aspect of metaphors for understanding, allusions for understanding this. I also wonder why those particular examples, and so this is why I'm asking about temporality of ideology as a material thing, and what that process could look like, or is it not a specific answer to that? Sorry if that was rambling.
Hi. Okay. No, that's a very good question. It's a difficult question. Look, I mean, in the German ideology, Marx and Engels, okay, well, what they're doing is that first of all, you're absolutely right to emphasize that ideology has material effect. So it's not unreal. To say that something is ideological is not to say that it's unreal or merely illusory. it's simply to say, but it's simply to kind of to say that it's a symptom. It's a symptom of a reality which it does not, transparently represent, or which it's incapable of, mapping in using its own conceptual resources alone. So there's a link therefore between material production and ideology. Ideology, which is simply how human beings in a way kind of think about and understand themselves in the most kind of general sense. And by the way, in German ideology, Marx and Engels say that priests are the first ideologues. Okay, so the division of labor is a condition for ideological production, and once you have once kind of material production has advanced to the stage where you can have a privileged class which is exempted from the need to work, to contribute to the task of material production, then, well, two things. Then you have the kind of the class of of kings or nobles, who benefit from the material goods provided by the rest of society, and then you have an intellectual class whose function is to provide the legitimation for this division of labor and for this exemption of labor, exemption from labor by this privileged social class. So in a way, ideology performs a very specific social function, and it's part and parcel of the machinery of social reproduction. Okay, if you don't have, it's there in a way, so it's there to legitimate class stratification and the division of labor, and therefore to make sure that the whole thing kind of keeps going. Sorry, can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Okay. I thought I had muted my. Okay. Good. Okay. So in that sense, ideology, in a way, it's the picture with, I think, Marx and Engels, it's more complicated. It's like you've got kind of material, got material production, productive forces, and then productive relations of production, which generates a kind of a class stratification and a division of labor. And then the ideologues emerge as those whose specific social function is there to kind of to justify this stratification and this division. Therefore there's a history, and so therefore there's a historicity to the function of ideology, because the function of ideology becomes more and more itself internally differentiated and complicated as a society evolves in productive sophistication and differentiation. So in a way, so there is a kind of a historicity to ideology, but the term historicity is ambiguous here. In a way, intellectual history, an intellectual historian could be charting the historicity of ideology within an intra-ideological framework. Okay, so in a way, you could chart the historicity of ideology, but still without ever kind of exiting from the ideological sphere. But I guess if you're from a Marxist point of view, what has to be understood is how the intellectual history, or the historicity of ideological products, or the history of ideas is conditioned by the history of production, or by the history of modes of production. And you'd have to be able to tie transformations, conceptual transformations to material transformations. I take that to be the kind of the desideratum for a kind of a Marxist account. But things become complicated when one starts talking about history in terms of modes of production. And this is, Althusser, yes, I think Althusser kind of rightly points out that there's a fundamental difficulty here, because in a way, history itself, or what we call history, is ideological through and through. I mean, who writes history? Okay, so it's not as if that there's a kind of a sequence of historical facts which can simply be kind of which are out there and which can just simply be kind of recuperated by the fastidious historian, because the conditions under the conditions under which historical narratives are themselves generated and produced, are variable, will vary, according to, modes of production, which is why one can't simply kind of, stipulate a continuity or a linear kind of evolution of modes of production. And I think this is why by the time you get to Capital, as for when Marx is writing Capital, I think, or at least, and I think in the most, theoretically kind of sophisticated and compelling interpretations of, what he's doing in there, it's, we don't, the capitalist totality, in a way, conditions and influences our understanding of pre-capitalist social formations. In other words, we can't simply, chart the evolution of societies from, primitive to feudal to capitalist in some kind of straightforward evolutionary sequence, because there are, because there are discontinuities, structural and categorical discontinuities. Structural discontinuities at the level of material production, categorical discontinuities at the level of the conceptual resources through which we describe and explain material production. So I think it gets, I think it's the historicity of ideology is complex, because it has to be, in a way, charted across, in these two different, kind of dimensions. Okay, so that's an attempt to answer that question. But it's also, just as an aside, it's also why the historical, just as what Marx means by materialism isn't obvious. He's not a metaphysical materialist. Matter for him is not just this kind of stuff that's out there, and nor can one kind of cash out the meaning of materialism by adverting to economic facts, because the whole point of Marx's critique of political economy is that there are no such neutral economic facts, some trans-historical economic facts that can provide the basic foundation for a science of economies. Okay, so when sometimes again people say, well, Marx is a materialist because he emphasizes the primacy of the economic. What does that even mean? What does it mean? What is the whole point about the critique of political economy is that to understand what an economy is, what a relationship, the dynamics of social production and reproduction, there are no ready-made categories for charting that dynamic. Okay, so what economics means, I mean, economics is an ideological category as well. So I think this is why it's simply kind of unsatisfactory to say that Marx is some kind of, Marx is not an economic determinist. Okay? His materialism is not tied to kind of, to a kind of a stratum of economic reality, as if this was kind of incontrovertibly kind of, material and self-evidently determining all of social reality. And history you know, history. What is it? You know, what does it mean to emphasize the historicity of consciousess and of our understanding of ourselves and our social relations? Well, on one level, it means that everything that we shouldn't eternalize or essentialize, you know, things that are contingent historical products. But again, that doesn't give you, that critical claim in and of itself doesn't give you a positive characterization of what history actually is. So if history is the sequence of modes of production, the history, you know, if history is necessarily the history of modes of production, precisely because a mode of production is not kind of empirically accessible, you know, you can't simply identify mode of production on the basis of, you know, empirically accessible facts. You have to kind of reconstruct it. So understanding the relations between modes of production and the transition from one mode of production to another is also kind of a complicated business, I think, in Marx. Okay, there's a couple of other questions, I think. So there's a comment, the same is true, elites hash out ideology to have people vote against their interests, such as the case in American working class Southerners. Is this a remark or a question?
Ray, can I ask a question?
Ray, can I ask a question?
Yes, sure, yes.
I might have missed this.
I might have missed this.
It's really simple.
Really simple.
You say that the situation is misrecognized by. Why did Marx say that the situation of people? Why do they misrecognize it precisely? Oh, shit, no.
Sorry, hello? Yeah. It's in, when Marx talks about the camera obscura in the German ideology, he says that real social relations are inverted in ideological consciousness. So the claim is that people, I think he elaborates more on this in Capital, but the idea is that there's a discrepancy between what we are practically engaged in doing every day of our lives at the level of buying and selling commodities and exchanging commodities, and what we actually understand ourselves to be doing. And I think that this is tied to Marx's accounts of real abstraction, that the exchange of commodities, in order for commodities to be exchangeable, there's a set of the activities that we're engaged in collectively and the social relations that are generated by our activities are unintelligible to us. And this is why the critique of political economy is necessary. This is what Marx is trying to do, is trying to explain what it is we're actually doing every day we buy and sell commodities. And he thinks this has to be explained because he thinks that we kind of systematically and habitually misunderstand what it is we're doing. And it's not just that we misunderstand, is that we necessarily misunderstand it, because it's a condition of our being able to do it, to keep on engaging in this activity, that we don't consciously comprehend it. I take that to be his claim. Does that help?
Yeah. I get that. I understand that we are misrecognized. I have my ideas of why that might be, but I just didn't quite get why Marx was saying it was the case. But yeah, no, that's it. I understand it. Yeah.
Ray, you're muted again.
Sorry, Billy, shall I read the question you asked earlier, or you wrote earlier in the sidebar?
Sure.
Okay. So the question is, what about the topic, tonic of map making, shoddy cartography and illiteracy? What are some archetypes for neutral mediums? What is a style of music that would coalesce to the materialist inversion theory of contradiction? Can the echo of the ruler measure the frame? Okay, you're going to have to help me a bit to unpack, because I'm not sure I understand all the terms here. So first, what about the topic tonic of map making, shoddy cartography, and illiteracy? So what are some archetypes for neutral media? So do you mean that even mapping itself is how
Bucky Fuller redesigned the map, and how we can create divisions based on layout plans, just as an aside, and maybe that would lead somewhere else. Tonic, I guess, it's, one of the models for a universal freedom. You talked about this, it's not atemporal or invariable. It's universal freedom archetype. And I thought of the map as our universe, and it's not accurate, and it's very hard to map out correctly. And there's the Dymaxion map by Bucky Fuller. You mentioned neutral mediums. Sorry, I could stop. That's...
Ray, you're muted again.
Sorry, yeah, I know who Buckminster Fuller is, but I'm not familiar with this. Could you tell us a bit more about this map that he constructed? Because I don't actually, it might help to kind of, if you tell us a bit more about this map that he made or developed, it might kind of help, clarify the issue, basically, or the point you're trying to raise.
You're muted, Billy.
My computer's not letting me look up a page for it. There you go.
Dymaxion, okay, Dymaxion map. Okay. It's a projection of a world map onto the surface of an icosahedron, which can be unfolded and flattened in 2 dimensions. Okay. Well, actually, yeah, this is relevant. Actually, this raises a very interesting topic, actually, which will come up later. I mean, in terms of ideological inversion, okay, the sense in which ideology inverts social relations, in a way, there's a kind of there's an issue about dimensionality here, about whether you are kind of trying to map a higher dimensional reality in a lower dimensional medium, let's say. And I think this is why, in a way, the metaphor of inversion is insufficient to grasp Marx's point, because it's not just that ideology works just by kind of things, the inversion is not just operative in a single dimension, up, down. It's not just about, so it's not as if you can kind of undo the effects of ideology by simply kind of turning things the right way up. The point is that there are like several different dimensions of social reality, which undergo a kind of transformation when they are ideologically represented. And we have to understand, in a way, that the conditioning mechanism, we have to understand how ideology is generated, the mechanisms which generate ideology, which are themselves, I think, multidimensional, in order then to be able to understand, in a way, the correspondence between features of the ideological map and, the features of the reality that is conditioning the generation of the map. I think this is part of, and I think this is exactly what Marx is doing when he's writing Capital, which is why it's such a kind of complicated book. It's both the starting point for Marx's, project, his theoretical project, is political economy and the categories of political economy as understood as systematically, misrepresenting or inverting in more than one dimension actual social reality. But the social reality is not itself kind of is not transparent to the theorist. If Marx thought that social reality was transparent to the critic of political economy, then he would be doing just exactly what he's just criticized philosophers for doing, for trying to grasp in theoretical consciousness the reality of productive activity. And in a way that the point is that practice, it's not just that practice is multidimensional, but that we need the resources for mapping practices, or for kind of for being able, for properly characterizing practices, social practices, have to be constructed. So I think this is what. So I think, in a way, this whole problematic of mapping is part and parcel of Marx's critical project. But he's trying to kind of construct a map in which its own conditions of generation are themselves encoded, if I can put it that way. And in a way, that's what Capital is. It's a mapping of social. It's a representation of social reality. But which actually, in which are encoded the conditions under which that representation stands to that reality, and an account also of the mechanisms through which this reality generates its own mapping or conceptual representation. Okay, there's a can I explain this again? Yes, okay. It's basically saying is that if you take, what does Marx say about, what is his whole critique of philosophy? Saying, well, philosophers have only interpreted. And his point is that every interpretation is conditioned by social practices which are not transparently interpretable. Okay? The point is that practice is not transparent to interpretation, which is why practice is not simply an interpretable object. So the point of the critique of political economy is to, first of all, to understand the relationship between practice and theory, or practice and interpretation, and then to generate a theory, which is, Marx's capital, a theory that both, that insists upon this relationship between the claim that, all interpretation is conditioned by practice, and then tries to generate, conceptual resources that allow you to understand how interpretation is conditioned by practice in a way which isn't simply reinterpretable in theory. This is why capital is not just another interpretation of the world. Okay? The critique of political economy can't simply be another interpretation of reality. And this is why Marx has to insist that there's something about the dimension of practice which is uninterpretable, okay? Which is why you have to construct the conceptual categories that allow you to be able to, to map these practices in a way that will explain the interpretations which are their symptoms. Okay, how they generate certain kind of ideological interpretations which misrepresent them, but which also explains why this theory is not itself just another interpretation, and it stands and therefore why it can be the precondition for a transformative practice. So this is very abstract at this point. I think this will become clearer when we look at Marx's remarks on method in the Grundrisse, where he contrasts, the concrete in thought and the concrete in reality, and then when we actually look at the, the capital, his whole account of the commodity fetish. So Billy has a question, without seeming virtual, I'm getting at with the neutral mediums, what something could be while treading the thin line of just being opacity to the critic. I need some help to kind of unpack that question. Billy, would you like to maybe kind of elaborate a little bit on your question?
Maybe someone else could give a question, and I'll just keep that in my head, and I'll pitch in, and it'll be related later.
You're muted, Ray.
Sure. Okay. Sure. Yes, and so Mary, this remark, the whole point is not about the point to say that practices are uninterpretable is to say that they can't simply be construed as objects of interpretation. They can be understood. The point is to kind of to understand what they are, to give some kind of conceptual characterization of them. So here's an example: the exchange abstraction. So what is at the roots of what is the practice which is at the heart of capitalism? Well, it's commodity exchange. Okay, so it's like buying and selling commodities, and what Marx is trying to elaborate is the logic that governs the exchangeability of commodities. Okay, so the logic of commodity production and the logic of commodity exchange, which is to say the logic of commodification. And the point is that this logic, isn't simply open to interpretation. It's like Marx takes himself to be a scientist who's penetrating to the reality behind the appearances, behind the ideological appearances. And it's only, and this is the link between he thinks, unlike merely philosophical theories, his theory implies a revolutionary practice, okay, which will transform this reality from the ground up. And it's because, and in a way, that's why it's not just another interpretation. It's because it's describing and explaining these constitutive practices in a way which will allow us to act in a way, and therefore transform the reality that is generated in and through these practices. Because the whole point is that social reality is one that is that we generate by doing. We keep it going by everything we do on a daily basis. But it's because we don't really understand, we don't know what it is we're doing, that we're incapable of changing it. Marx's kind of optimistic gambit is that once we properly understand what it is we're actually doing, then we can do something else. Or not just do something else, but actually create a modality of doing that will transform the reality that we are constantly generating. Yes, that's it. That's why. So, that's why he talks about uncovering the laws of historical, the laws of motion of capital, as he puts it, the laws of motion of capital. But remember, and this is for Marx now. So the reason why Marx's project can't be, Marx doesn't see himself, sees himself as a social scientist, but he doesn't think that social science can be modeled on physical science, because social phenomena are radically different in kind from physical phenomena. So the laws of motion, of capital and other modes of production, are not laws, in the familiar types of laws identified by empirical sciences.
Can I ask one more thing? You mentioned, can you hear me if I mute my microphone, because it's feeding back to me and confusing me? Can you still hear me? Yes. You mentioned before when Marx was talking about reinterpreting Feuerbach's interpretation of sensation or nature as more like a social practice and a historical sort of interpersonal practice, that Marx I was thinking when you were saying this, this is a kind of isn't Marx just reinscribing a kind of idealism here that Feuerbach would reject? And you mentioned a kind of a social constructivism or something, where ideas are shaping reality historically or something. But you said that Marx is very clear about the distinction, that there is a kind of nature that isn't sort of shaped historically. But where does Marx say that? like, where does he make that that kind of distinction between the natural world, or the sensuous that can be historically sort of shaped, if you like, and something that can't? Because I don't know. Maybe I just think in the history of like the implementations of Marxism, there is a kind of maybe a kind of idealism where everything is kind of political or something, everything is historical. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I'll try to respond. Okay, well, in a way, part of what, there's a sense in which Marx's rejoinder to Feuerbach is very Hegelian, when he insists on the fact that all, there is no kind of dimension of sensuous immediacy that isn't, so to speak, always already kind of, socially mediated. Socially mediated as opposed to kind of mediated by the concept or the notion for Hegel. But in a way, it's a very Hegelian rejoinder to Feuerbach. So yeah, and moreover, insofar as the social relation is precisely what isn't transparent to, not even to self-consciousness. The social relation is not something that we are kind of, spontaneously aware of in our day-to-day practical activity. It can only be, it has to be kind of conceptually reconstructed using abstract resources. So that also seems to make, Marx quite idealist. But I think Marx is interesting, because Marx's proposal is that in order to, the meaning, the relationship between the abstract and the concrete undergoes a kind of a radical shift in capitalist society. And he accepts Hegel's claim that, there's nothing that's, nothing is, self-evidently kind of, concrete or abstract in and of itself. Everything is mediated, and you can't simply oppose the concrete to the abstract. You have to understand how everything can be considered, as everything can be considered as both at once. Okay. And this is why he thinks, in a way, when he's writing Capital, he thinks it's precisely the most abstract philosophical system provides you with the conceptual resources required to characterize, to describe a reality which is structured around real abstractions, because abstractions become real in capitalism, so that both, the exchange, commodity exchange is an abstraction. The labor which generates exchangeable commodity is also abstract labor. So he thinks that our society is, in a way, is saturated with abstractions that are generated through practice, not through conceptualization. So in a way, this is, again, and we'll see that one of the most important aspects of Marxist thinking is this idea that there's this discovery of real abstractions, that there is a dimension of abstraction which isn't generated by intellection, or which is not the result of an intellectual operation, but that is actually, that is real. And by real, he means sensuous, because Marx's point is that what is sensuousness? It's practical activity. But practical activity is precisely what is imperceptible to us, and therefore completely abstract to us. Marx's gambit is that you can use the resources of what seems to be the most extreme kind of philosophical idealism, i.e. Hegel's, to generate a critique of a concrete social formation, which is capitalism. But as far with regard to your specific point, I mean, in quotation number 4 on the handout, okay, this is from in the German ideology, when he's saying, it's Marx and Engels criticizing Feuerbach, saying that this unceasing sensuous labor and creationist production is the foundation of the whole sensuous world as it now exists. So in other words, the sensuous world as we experience it or know it is conditioned by our practical activity, which is itself sensuous, which unfolds in the medium of sensuousness. So in what he's saying that there's a dimension of sensuality which is abstract because it's the result of ideological categorizations, but it's generated by a concrete sensuousness, which is the dimension of labor or of practical activity. Okay, and this practical activity unfolds in a sensuous dimension, which he thinks is, unproblematically real, but that doesn't mean, its ultimate nature again is not cognitively